for having me. And yes, thanks for taking the time out to talk about this this evening. I hear that there are so many really important ways to be spending your time right now. Yes, thank you for having me. Please do feel free to interrupt with questions or comments, your experiences, your knowledge as locals from Orange County. For those who don't know, I'm based in actually outside of Boston. I'm in Ohio right now visiting my parents. Um, and Yes, we have a small company called Civilytics Consulting, and we do budget analysis for several groups working in the kind of intersection between detention and community resources. Because unfortunately, while you might want to just focus on the community resources as well, the incarceration and law enforcement and quote unquote public protection is really what's sucking up so much of county dollars. So we work with many groups, kind of approaching it from one side or the other, or finding out that they have to kind of work on both at once.
Hannah, before
Yes.
you get started, can I ask a real quick question
Hmm.
and let the room know that Civilytics, you and Jared, this is not your first rodeo, at least not in Orange County. So could you give just a short elevator talk about what you've learned in past years in the county, so that people will have a little understanding of where you're coming from?
And
Thank you.
also statewide. I mean, the expertise and the view is amazing. So go for it.
Absolutely. So we've been working with HHROC and People's Budget Orange County for at least 3 or 4 years now. And I know our first year we were just totally confused by the augmentations element because while we've worked with groups in LA County, Alameda County, San Bernardino, and then we also do work at the state budget level for Californians United for Responsible Budget. We've never seen this augmentations approach before. So that was one of the first things that we kind of struggled to wrap our head around in previous years and really understand. I think what one of the things that we have kind of learned from looking at the Orange County budget over time is that there's a tendency to, in the budget, kind of talk about Orange County as being super constrained with its resources, and every dollar is already tied up and spoken for, and that there's a real sense of constraint. But if you compare it to other counties or to other local governments, not just in California, but nationally, as you know, I mean, Orange County is really on the whole an incredibly affluent place. And so, often there will be $1,000 or more to spend per resident um, on various services, and that's really fairly unique or fairly well off compared to what a lot of local governments are operating with. So that's one thing I think we've sort of observed over the years is the difference between the rhetoric and the reality of the amount of funds available. Is that a useful overview of our?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Mhm. Absolutely. So can you all see my presentation now? Okay.
Hannah, I don't think you're sharing screen yet.
Oh, okay. Let me try again. Mhm. Okay.
There we go.
Okay,
So
great.
something's happening. There we
Okay,
go.
great. Great.
Thank
All
you.
right. All right. So again, please stop in. I know some people have already seen this presentation once last week, so if you have any questions or additional insights, please share. All right. So overall, I just want to point out that all graphics and exhibits by exhibits, I mean tables and charts, and numbers in this presentation are from the county budget or the Citizens Guide to the Budget. And we think it's really important to always be able to, as an advocate, refer back to the primary source, right? Because it's easy for the government to question your numbers or your figures or how'd you come to that conclusion. And we want to, as much as possibly, be saying, well, these are your numbers. We're just taking what you said and we're just asking questions about it. We're pointing out problems with it. So I'll be really clear anytime we have a chart or other information that draws from materials outside the budget. And if you attended our presentation last year, you might recall that our theme was let's step into the spin zone because there's just so much spin around not the numbers itself in the budget, but the framing of it in the county CEO's letter, in the Citizens Guide to the budget, and in sort of the front matter that shapes the budget, as well as that budget workshop or budget presentation that they had for the community last week or the week before. So anyway, the spin. But this year we thought our theme might be there is a kernel of truth here. And I'll keep returning to this as we go on because throughout you'll see, okay, some underlying fact or piece of information is accurate, but then the extrapolation or what's made of that information, goes far beyond that actual kernel of truth. So the big picture, right? How much money is there in the Orange County budget, and how is it divided up across different areas, both of revenue, so the money that's incoming to the county, and expenditures, how they're spending the money that's available. So last year, the total Orange County budget was $9.5 billion. This year, it's $10.8 billion. So it's grown by about $1.2 billion. But the interim CEO budget letter frames this as all challenges, no positives, right? So the letter reads, changes in the federal administration, inflationary pressures on the economy, and lower than budgeted revenue growth have all challenged the county's ability to balance the budget within its limited resources. The county's commitment to providing essential mandated services to the community is resolute despite these challenges. So when, Pat and Dave and others reached out this year, I thought, well, the budget sounds like it's going to be kind of dire. There's these three huge challenges, and the county is doing its best to balance the budget within these limited resources. But in reality, the county's budget grew by $1.2 billion. And that's a 12.8% growth rate compared to last year. And that's $388 more per resident to spend than last year. So the kernel of truth is that the federal budget is dire, and that affects the state and county budgets, not always immediately, but down the road. That's I think we can't argue with that. But a lot of counties would be thrilled with a budget increase of greater than $1 billion and greater than 12% in 1 year and greater than $300 per resident. That's a lot of new money to work with. So, it's not all right it's not all in the bucket of revenue that the county has the most control over. That's true. There are three buckets of yeah, we can think of them as three buckets. They might be a little bit more discrete than that, but there are three buckets of types of revenue that the county has: dedicated revenue, other general funds, and general purpose revenue, also called GPR, sometimes also called net county cost. So uh, the biggest bucket is dedicated revenues. And let me just say, if you do have any questions, please interrupt me because I can see that people have chats, but I can't actually see the chat. So please just go ahead and go off mute if you have questions. Okay, so the biggest bucket of revenue is the dedicated revenue. Last year, there was $4.7 billion in dedicated revenue. This year, it's $5.4 billion, so an increase of about $700 million. Dedicated revenue is earmarked for certain services, like the airport, waste and recycling, road, flood. The money is raised for and can only be used on these things. You can see that they switched, their graphical presentation of this information since last year. I hypothesized later on that maybe it was because they were getting some pushback and saying, oh, the different pie charts kind of kind of highlight the problem with the amount of funds going to public protection, which I'll share later. But if you look closely, you can see that the percentages, despite the difference in graphical presentation, are pretty much the same. So last year, let's see. Last year, they spent 4% of dedicated revenue on public protection. This year, it's 3%. Community services were 24%. This year, 22%. The big difference in terms of the share of dedicated revenue, where it's going, is to insurance reserves and miscellaneous. And I'll talk about this category in more detail later, but that's really where you see. So overall, it's up $700 million, but in terms of the share going to different uses, it's pretty much the same as last year, except for this one category, which is important. The second biggest bucket is other general funds. So this is the area. This is how they group money that is received from, for instance, state and federal programs to support services within the social services agency, within healthcare, for specific grants, etc. Again, they don't have that much flexibility with how they can use this fund because it's really money that's received for these specific purposes. Last year, the revenue in this category was 3.7 billion. This year it's 4.2 billion. So again, it's up about $500 million, quite a substantial increase. But the share going to different services is pretty similar to last year. For instance, you see, 28% to public protection last year, 25% to public protection this year. The difference here, though, is the same, that insurance reserves and miscellaneous was about 2% of this revenue last year, and now they're needing to devote 10%, or they're allegedly needing to devote 10% of dedicated revenue to that category. One thing I want to point out here is this is a revenue bucket that's likely to be most affected by the federal and state budgets, because again, it's money that's being received from sort of higher levels or different levels of government for specific programs. Okay, so the last bucket, the smallest bucket, but still really quite a bit of money, $1.2 billion, is general purpose revenue. This is revenue that's raised largely through property taxes, also through sales and other taxes, and motor vehicle license fees. This is money that the county may say that it's constrained in using, but really they have they have extremely large amount of discretion over how this um, funding is spent. Some other counties call this discretionary revenue, in fact. So again, called general purpose revenue, GPR, net county cost, NCC, all kind of terms for the same bucket of money raised from these general purpose taxes and fees. And you can see that they're not increasing that insurance and reserves percentage here. So that's about the same as last year. But the only thing that they are increasing the share of is funding for public protection. So instead of spending 51% of their discretionary revenue, or of the county's discretionary revenue on public protection this year, they're proposing to spend 53%. And as we'll show later in the presentation, that's an underestimate for a couple reasons, including augmentations. So going back to the idea of kernels of truth or framing, the key budget message says that when compared to the fiscal year 2024-25 adopted budget, this year's recommended budget reflects an increase of $1.2 billion, 12.8%. Yada, yada, yada. The budget increase is primarily related to non-general funds and is technical in nature to allow for transfers between funds, including internal borrowing or for operating purposes. So this is the kernel of truth. Yeah, the budget increase is larger, both in absolute dollars and percentages for the non-general funds, the first two buckets of revenue that we looked at first. But discretionary revenue, GPR, net county costs, whatever you want to call it, that they have the most control over, it's still up $78.5 million compared to last year, and almost 7% compared to last year. So that's really a tremendous amount of new money, and a large share of new money to really make decisions about how to spend. And it's not just increasing by inflation either. This is from the budget as well, and they show forecast inflation for the county as well as for the state and the country. And you can see that forecast inflation is 2.6%. So the increase in GPR is more than double of that. So that's kind of that's one key big picture aspect to understand. The other big picture aspect to understand, and if you've been involved in the budget advocacy for years, or you've attended these presentations before, you won't be surprised by this, but you may be continue to be depressed, right? Or really wish that everyone in the county would just understand this simple kind of fact that there's a huge imbalance in budgeted public protection dollars compared to community resources. So, as you know from looking at the budget in the past, or attending presentations in the past, the share of dollars devoted to public protection grows dramatically from the total budget, which is on the far left, to the discretionary budget, which is on the far right. So when we look at total county appropriations, the $10.8 billion budget, public protection takes up 17% of that money. As we move to the general fund appropriation, it takes up a increasing share, 31%. And by the time we've moved to net county costs, the money that is coming directly from um, Orange County property owners, sales tax payers, and people with vehicles in the county, so that when it's coming directly from residents, 53% of the total amount of dollars is going just to public protection. And again, I'm going to show that that's an undercount. So it's actually even worse than this, because almost half of the 17% that's devoted to community services is for healthcare for people in jail. And now, I don't want anyone on this presentation or listening to the recording to take away that we, don't think people who are jailed should receive healthcare, but it's hardly what people mean by community services. It's not healthcare for anyone. It's healthcare for people who are jailed. And that's not what people think of when they think of like 17% of the budget going to community services. So on the last slide, we saw this 17.1% for community services. That's what that actually corresponds to is $207 million. So of the $207 million of net county cost, Orange County dollars devoted to community services, almost $100 million is for the healthcare agency. But of this, 86%, $85.8 million is for correctional health services. So this is the first, chart that I've created that doesn't come from the budget. And no charts or tables in the budget show this, but if we ranked how the community services net county cost was spent, it would go first 46% to the social services agency, and then 41% to correctional health services. So well over a third of the alleged net county cost for community services is actually going to correctional health services. And if we took the correctional health services spending out of community services, out of the bright blue and, put it with the darker blue, it would show now that 59.7% of net county costs, so almost 60% of the county's discretionary revenue is going to public protection and only 10% to community services. And it's even worse than that, because this is still before the restore and expand augmentations. So what are augmentations? And again, stop me if you have any questions. So to understand augmentations, which like I was saying at the beginning, Jared and I did not several years ago, you have to understand OC's budget process. And so how OC creates their budget, and like Pat said, it's a process that's continually in motion. So right now we're at the recommended budget stage, then it will be adopted. Then later on the year it will be modified as the county learns more about what revenue it actually has, and as programs actually spend funds, then they'll have additions where they add money to different programs as they need to reflect actual spending. So it's always, in process. But what is, and with certain key times, like now with the recommended budget. But how they start, a budget for the year is they have a base budget that's built by looking at funding levels from the prior year, including or especially net county cost. And the county asks departments to assume 0% growth in net county cost and make reductions to meet that limit. So how would they spend the money? What would they have to cut if they were going to keep level, flat fund, no increase in net county cost? But then, this is sort of an exercise that everyone knows is false because net county cost, historically has grown, and this year it actually grew 6.93% or $78 million. So anyway, departments submit augmentations to restore services that would be cut if they had to meet that NCC limit and had to flat fund everything. And the augmentation budget then represents how the county intends to spend its new net county cost revenue this year. So all new money over what they had last year. There are 4 types of augmentations: technical, reduce, restore, and expand. The first 2 types are incorporated in the main budget, and then you have to look at a separate document for the other 2, which is really kind of sneaky. And would be really useful, I think, to the average person just to be able to see them all in one document. But so technical is just like what it sounds like, modifications that they made, especially throughout the year, um, just to adjust things. Reduce is how they would cut things to get back to that 0% increase in net county cost. And then looking at the other budget, restore is, oh, we're putting back these services or these people or things that are already in the budget, but we couldn't fund if our money didn't increase. And expand is really new programs. So the 4 types of augmentations and the explanation about looking at a separate document are both covered in the budget itself. So this year, there were very few expand augmentations. There were some new positions, but they are all funded through grants or dedicated revenue, existing fees, things like that, where the county isn't contributing any cost to the position, so they have no net county cost. And then there's a small amount of new net county cost for this one program, but it's only one time, it's not ongoing. So basically, there's not much going on in the expand augmentations this year. And so we aren't going to focus on those for the rest of the presentation. But in the restore augmentations, there's a lot going on. There are 122 positions proposed to restore, quote unquote restore, to public protection, and 16 for community services, 28 for general government. But it's actually even more positions for public protection if we think of the positions in correctional health services, not as community services, because again, that's not what people think when they think of something that's benefiting the community, something that's only sort of providing some basic bare minimum level to care to people who are jailed, right? It's really those are positions that were created by the public protection, functions, the law enforcement functions of selecting and choosing who is jailed and for how long. Anyway, so all of the community services positions are actually in correctional health services. So if we thought of it that way instead, it would also increase the amount spent on public protection by $22.5 million. So of the $37.6 million allegedly going to community services, 22.5 million, about 2/3, is actually for correctional health. So this is another, Civilytics created chart showing that if we moved that $22.5 million, this is what the restore augmentation support. So 77% of the most discretionary revenue, the new net county cost, new revenue that the county didn't have last year, but does have this year, thanks to taxpayers and people who are paying vehicle license fees. 77% of that money is going to public protection. So if we add that new chart to this series that we've been looking at, moving from least discretionary to most discretionary, you see that when the county CEO is recommending how to spend the increased net county cost, 77% of the new funds, $110 million, go to public protection, and only 10%, $15 million, go to community services. So what will the county say about this, right? What is the kernel of truth? Well, the kernel of truth is that public protection is what the county has already decided to spend money on in the past. So just getting back to those positions and activities that the county funded last year does require increases, right? Because there are negotiated pay raises, there are increases in insurance costs, their costs are rising. So to a certain extent, because of history and past decisions, there's a real bias. There's a real pull toward spending that new revenue on public protection, just as it has gone to them in the past. But, we can also look at, well, what are the specifics, right? Like, what do they what did they say they need that new money for? And with the sheriff, it's really egregious and from an advocacy perspective, really clear that they're just actually requesting the additional funds, not for specific positions, not for, really popular programs that they want to continue, but for overtime. So the entire sheriff augmentation request is actually just for overtime, $62 million. The sheriff coroner requests restoration of overtime associated with the $62.1 million. That's it, right? So, one really clear augmentation related thing to message this year is that instead of spending $62 million of the new county dollars on sheriff overtime, what if we spent any net county cost on housing? And this even, a couple more things about the overtime issue, right? We can't even tell from the budget how much the sheriff's office spent on overtime last year. There is a little bit of information about overtime spending for funds that pay less that aren't in the net county cost. So for example, we know waste and recycling had $2 million in overtime last year, but we don't know, was the sheriff's overtime $62 million? Was it more than that? We can't learn that from the budget. And also, that's not all the overtime generated sort of by the sheriff's office and the jail, because Correctional Health Services is also requesting restoration of net county costs to pay overtime. But in this case, we can't tell how much of the net county cost request is for overtime versus for other things, because it's all lumped together. And that's a real big flaw, a intentional flaw, I'm sure, but flaw in the in the Orange County budget in terms of transparency.
Can I ask a couple of questions, Hannah?
Yes, please do.
This is Tom Fielder. So I believe you said towards the beginning that system of so-called augmentations approach to budgeting.
I think you might have cut out, Tom, at least for me.
Oh, okay. Let me try again. I believe towards the beginning of your talk that you said that the system of augmentations, this approach to budgeting, is unique in your experience.
Right. Yes, like I said, we've reviewed several budgets in California, and none of them uses augmentations approach, nor have any of we probably reviewed 50 budgets across the US, and we've never seen this approach before.
Yeah. So why? Why did they adopt this?
I don't know. I mean, maybe someone else on this call knows more about it. I think in a certain way, there was a phase or a theory of doing zero-based budgeting, which is not the same as this. It's the idea that we start from a zero base where we build up our whole budget each year. And that was a fiscal reform to, instead of just take everything as a given and incrementally adjust over time, we'll try to start fresh and think about where our money should go. That was a fiscal reform, but I think it didn't pan out well because budgets are just so complicated and um, people didn't have the time, like city and county officials didn't have the time to really um, follow through on that. So I don't know if this is like a sort of like a fiscal, like fiscal, an idea of being like a fiscally conservative response of, well, assume flat, then what do you want to do with the rest? That would be my guess, but I don't actually know any of the history. My guess would be that it's an idea of being fiscally responsible and seeing where you're going to use your new money and not going over what we spent last year until we know for sure we have the revenue. That would be my guess.
Okay. And then my other question is, so when a department makes a request for, say, a restore augmentation, what's the change?
I think you might have cut out again. Did he for others?
What happens after that, I guess, is my question.
Unfortunately, from my experience reviewing the Orange County budget, and I'm curious to hear what others say, from my experience to reviewing it is that it just that they present it at the recommended budget stage in a separate document, and then it passes, and then in the adopted budget, it's just in with the regular budget. So if it passes, if all the augmentations are approved by the Board of Supervisors, then they just get incorporated into the adopted budget, and that becomes the new budget. And from what I've seen, not much has been changed from recommended to adopted, but I'm sure others may have more insight into that.
Who has the power to change it
The Board of
after just the board, or
I mean, again, others correct me if you have a different understanding, but my understanding is the Board of Supervisors.
it is?
Like the
Okay.
the other
Wow.
problem, right, is that most counties, and you can see this when you look at the Orange County budget. If you look at, I mean, I could talk about this all night, which probably not. Um, if you look at it, at the budget, you can see they'll for last year's budget, they have they have the adopted, then they have the modified changes that were made mid-year, then they have estimated or projected where they think they'll be at the end of the year. And you can see that the department's overspent. And there's not usually a very rigorous cost control process. So officially, who has the ability to, you know, make decisions? Board of Supervisors. To some extent, departments also make decisions through their actions.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Okay, so that was everything about augmentations for this year. But again, let me just summarize and say that expand augmentations have little influence on the budget this year because they're for positions not funded by NCC. So we focus on the restore augmentations. 77% of those are for public protection, over $100 million once you group correctional health services there instead of under community services, and $62 million. So a really significant chunk, nearly half of the restore augmentations are just for sheriff's overtime. So,
Hannah, this is
yeah,
John Underwood. I'd like to uh, hover a little longer over that 62 million for a sheriff's overtime. Can we dissect that 62 million a little further? Can we identify that 62 million in overtime as being specific to um, uh, public protection in the carceral environment? That is to say, overtime in the jails themselves. can we get a little more precise in what that's, how to break down that 62 million?
Not from the budget, not from the augmentations document. This is the sum total of the information that's available in the budget document. So when you look at the full budget, it does break down the sheriff's department into different, I'm not sure if they called them divisions or uh, yeah, I usually call them divisions, I guess, like patrol and jail and things like that. So you can see they do break down some of the information that way in the regular budget, but in the augmentation section, this is all they have.
So I really don't know where that overtime is being directed
Not
precisely.
not at all. Nor do you know, is that the sum total of the overtime that they anticipate spending, or is that just is that a fraction of it?
Okay.
Hannah,
Hmm.
that 62 million, there's approximately 4,000 law enforcement, sworn officers in the county. So that means that like every officer, would earn over $15,000 more just in overtime if every single officer, equally was doing overtime.
Yes, I think that's a really good message. I think that's a really good way to help make it concrete for people. I'm also not surprised to see that. We did an interesting project at one point, maybe 2 years ago, when LA County, their auditor's office, published for each county employee how much they made in base salary, benefits, longevity pay, overtime, things like that. Um, and there were it will, I can't remember what the average was. I would think if I'm recalling correctly that it was like around 12 or $14,000 in overtime for the sheriff's department, but there were I think like 300 employees or something who had made more than 50,000 in overtime. I'd be happy to send you the link afterwards, but I do think it's a good way to talk about it so people understand what that means in real dollars, and B, that doesn't surprise me. It is consistent with what I've seen elsewhere. And that could be a good thing for, a news story or something like that. I'm located outside Boston, and every year the Boston Globe publishes the highest, which county employees make the most in overtime. And there are frequently people making 200,000 or more in overtime.
Thank you.
Mhm. Okay, so we're going to unfortunately, the other side of the coin, right? Or that we're going from polar opposite in terms of level of funding. So how is Orange County addressing the housing crisis? So the answer is not by spending its own money. So housing related services are in the community services area of the budget, which is where I was talking about before correctional health services are as well, and where correctional health services make up around 40% of net county cost in the community services area. So within the community services area of the budget, the housing related services main funds are the Orange County Housing Authority, which currently is expected to have about $327 million in funds in revenue for the year. And it's entirely funded through federal dollars. So this is one of the areas that's probably very at risk from the Trump administration, very at risk in terms of being funded at this level going forward. So that's the highest, that's the biggest source of housing related dollars in the Orange County budget. The second biggest source is called OC Housing. It's $16 million, also all federal grants. So this is things that people will recognize the names of: Community Development Block Grant, Home Investment Partnerships, Emergency Solutions Grant. And then there's the MHSA, Mental Health Services Act Housing Fund, really small amount comparatively, but again, these are the biggest ones for housing in the Orange County budget, and this is based on a formula allocation from the state. So all of the above are zero local dollars. What about local dollars? Well, did I have this here? Okay. Uh, I think I should have spent this put this in a little bit different. Oh no, this it does make sense. Okay, so this is the total all types of dollars for housing in the Orange County budget. So that includes the 300. So the biggest source you can see we're going to 353 million. We accounted for 327 million through the OCHA, and we accounted for 16 million through OC housing, and then it's other smaller bits as well. So in total, the Orange County budget devotes $353 million to housing and $1.3 billion to the sheriff. So in total spending, the sheriff's budget is nearly 4 times as much as the housing budget.
But that 353 million is pass-through funds.
Almost exclusively. The exception is $1.6 million.
Okay.
So if we look at just county spending, not county cost, we can't actually learn quite as much about housing as we would like. We know that in total, the county spending on community development and housing is grouped together. And we know in total that's $1.6 million. So really kind of pennies on the dollar. But we know the amount that the county spends on housing is no more than this. This is the total that they spend on that plus community development. So of their own money, $1.6 million to housing maximum and 356 million to the sheriff and jail. So,
And do we know
yeah.
exactly what that 1.6 million is
And
paying for?
we can tell that it's like how much is going to salaries and benefits, services and supplies, sort of those accounting categories, but we don't know anything about the activities that it's funding.
So we don't know if it's creating housing or if it's rental assistance or it could be any of those things, right?
Absolutely. It could even, I mean, presumably they have enough money in these programs to the OCHA and things like that to administer the programs, but I would guess there's still some like administrative costs that are kind of
Mhm.
paid for by to oversee the programs, I would guess, but we just can't tell anything because we don't have like a list of positions. And yeah, there's no breakdown within them about this number of positions devoted to this activity or anything like that.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I guess the other thing I'd say is that if it's going to salaries, it's not going to vouchers. It is going to the administration of something, but not the actual benefit.
Mhm. So if we look at this in terms of residents, so per resident, um, including children, the county is spending over $427 per resident on the sheriff and jails and only $112 on housing. And if you look at it in terms of the county's own money, net county cost, it's only spending about 50 cents on housing per resident and about $113 per resident on the sheriff.
So that's actually higher than last year on both categories. Last year it was 34 cents for housing per resident, and it was $102 per resident that they were spending on sheriffs.
And I
That's
didn't realize,
ugly.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize that was everybody, including children. I think that's a distinction. I was thinking it was adult voters or something that they use. That's interesting. Thank you for that.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay. Any other questions about this before I get into to mandates?
Yeah, and I'd like to go back for just a second to the question about uh, sheriff's overtime.
Mhm.
We are not able to suss out any more specific information about where that overtime is going, but certainly within the sheriff's budget itself, they should be aware, they should know how that breaks down and how much of that money is actually going into overtime for carceral services by the sheriffs. If I were to approach them with uh, with a public information request, would they be able to fulfill that? Do you think they should be able to respond with data that would further identify where that overtime will be going?
Definitely, I think so because they know who receives it. They know which officers receive the funding, and then they know what units or divisions each officer is assigned to. So even if I guess someone could be pulled away to, serve out of their usual role, I think in general they should be able to say this is how much officers in assigned to detention and corrections received. This is how much officers assigned to investigative services received, that sort of thing. So
And so, and so this would come under the heading, of course, this is public funds. These are taxpayer dollars. Um, so certainly
absolutely.
they would be obliged to respond in some manner. How direct or straightforward or how devious, their information might be, or how convoluted or purposely obfuscating. Nevertheless, they are required to respond, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
hmm Okay. So the kernel of truth about mandates. And this is also another one that's sort of been interesting to look across county budgets and see how different counties in California are talking about this, because for the most part, they're all subject to the same, they're all subject to the same what they mean as mandates, which are usually government codes. So Orange County, this is from the public budget workshop presentation this year. And Eve pointed out something that I thought was really smart, a very good, useful observation, which is that on the left side it says, "Did you know that the county is legally required or mandated to provide certain essential services to the public?" Which is certainly true. That's, yes, that our government is legally required to do certain things, right? But that's sort of divorced from the graph or the information on the right side, which says, how does the county use its property tax dollars? And implies that 89% of property tax dollars are going to mandated functions, so they're locked up in the icon here, whereas only 11% is going to non-mandated um, services or activities, so they're unlocked. So it's, the information on the left is accurate. There are legal mandates, but what it implies or leads you to infer on the right is that the legal mandates have something to do with the amount of dollars required, or the amount of property tax dollars required. And as I'll show on the next slides, that's not true. It's the activities or the functions are in place, but how much money it takes to do that is at the county's discretion. So in terms of what is this 89% of mandated dollars going toward, or what is the mandate, in terms of what the county is legally required or mandated to do for the sheriff's office, it all comes back to one California government code, or sections of this code that outline the duties of the sheriff in terms of uh, all all sorts of different things, I guess. But you know, so it's like under the section that's about different county government office elected officers, and there's all different sections like um, for other elected officers in counties. But if you look down to the sheriff's level, it has duties like the sheriff shall preserve peace, and to accomplish this may, do projects related to crime prevention, rehabilitation of persons previously convicted of crime, suppression of delinquency, etc. The sheriff can arrest people, the sheriff can prevent and suppress breaches of the peace, keep the county jail, etc. It goes on, but it kind of is at this very high level of like what are the duties of a sheriff. So the kernel of truth is that the sheriff is mandated to preserve the peace and other duties, but the county is not mandated to spend, greater than $1 billion to support the sheriff in doing this. And it's really interesting to look at the um, OC budget compared to other budgets, because the OC budget, in framing it, not so much in the budget itself when you get down to the tables, but in the framing, really makes it seem like percentage of dollars are mandated. But and they don't refer to what the mandate is. But if you look at other county budgets, like here's the example of Alameda County, it tells you what is the government code. It really briefly summarizes what the code says. And then it says like some services are discretionary, like emergency dispatch, because probably because the code was written. I don't know actually when the code was written, but probably some of these things were written before there were programs like emergency dispatch. I don't know. But contract police services, regional training center, crime lab, alternatives to incarceration. None of those are mentioned in the government code, so they're discretionary. And that's kind of where Alameda County budget leaves it. Some things we're doing are mandated, some things are discretionary, but we try to get later in the budget into what is mandated versus discretionary. LA County budget, it's similar in that it actually points to the government code sections, and then it consistently says mandated program with discretionary service level. Some places it says, discretionary program, but this is most of their programs they say are mandated with discretionary service level. So that's really key, right? The sheriff has to, or the sheriff is charged with taking charge of and being the sole and exclusive authority to keep the county jail, but it doesn't say anything about, how many people should be in jail, what should be our bail policy, who can be cited and released, all these things that affect how many people are in jail and for how long, and then create a discretionary service level in terms of how many people are then needed to oversee the incarceration. So, the one other thing I wanted to pose about mandated services, if you think about it, it's really striking. Like the county is saying that we have a mandate to provide all these public protection services, but then the mandate is really just things that, there's lots of different ways to accomplish that end. And I just wanted to pose the question, instead of, just having a mandate to have a sheriff, what if there was a mandate to provide housing? What if housing was a mandated service? Right now, the only housing that's provided as part of these mandated activities is in the jail. That only the main source, the main place that healthcare is provided is in the jail. What if mandated activities included, housing and healthcare? It would be just a strikingly different budget.
Eve has a comment in the chat. I don't know if you can see it. Do you want to say something about that, Eve? And I want to do a time check too, because I know you're in a different time zone, and I'm thinking within the half hour, we're signed our letter, got our last questions in, and figure out what else we need to know down the road, Hannah.
Yeah, and thanks for another wonderful presentation, Hannah. But it wasn't really a question, it was just a comment, but I was just thinking as you were talking that, so there's this mandate to have a sheriff's department and whatever. They do get dedicated funding from the dedicated revenue bucket and the general funds. So it's not like it's possible they don't have to spend any discretionary funding on the sheriff's department or the jails, and still fulfill their mandate, right? And yet that pie chart saying, did you know, that we have mandated services that we have to fund, it's just so misleading. It really burns me up.
Mhm. It is really misleading, and yeah, I agree with everything you said.
Um, And I just thought you'd like to know, and Alice, maybe you can chime in if there's something that you wanted to share with Hannah about our recent attendance at supervisor's budget meeting. One of the questions that I had posed to Supervisor Sarmiento um, was that I was really concerned, thanks to Civilytics, was really concerned that the county was, and I use the words, playing games with how they would label some of the budget dollars. And I use the example of healthcare for inmates going into community services, and um, uh, let him know that we supported that the inmates should certainly have health care, but in the operation of the public protection, you know, that was totally misleading and misplaced. And he said, "Yeah, I know, I agree." And he said, I'm hopefully going to be successful in changing some of those what you call games that the county plays with how they label things." But he says, thank you for recognizing that. Well, I got to thank you, but I wanted it's because of you and Jared that because of Civilytics that helped to bring that question to the table. Um, and also, as after the meeting ended, had a few moments to share with the
Mary.
CFO
Oh,
and just briefly talking to her about the same issue.
yeah.
And she hemmed and hawed, but used the excuse that because the county healthcare provides the services, that the healthcare is under community services, and that's why it's listed there. Um, so that was her argument and justification for it. Alice?
What? Yeah, no, I thought one of the things that was interesting is that she positioned herself as part of the sheriff's department. Didn't she say that she worked in the sheriff's department for a while, or was that the other woman?
No, she reviewed the sheriff's budget according to
Yeah.
her, to
Oh,
the
that's what
penny
she
for,
did. Yeah, she was,
yeah.
yeah, she was connected. The nice thing about David's question was that it was almost like a sigh of relief that from which Sarmiento connected with your question. I think he does stand alone, and I think the more we can be uncovering some of this information, the easier it will be for him to have that weight of outer knowledge, not just in-house knowledge, but knowledge of the community.
Yeah, thank you. I just found that interesting, and you had kudos coming your way along with Jared for making us seem wise when it was all just you.
Well, once you learn it for one year, right, you just remember it for the next year. And hopefully someone else heard it at the presentation and thought, because it's just the budget is so long and you'd have to really look into it to see that. And yes, it is within the healthcare agency, but then when you make graphics that are supposed to be community, it's one thing when you track the funds internally, but when you make graphics that are allegedly um, communicating to your residents, that's another story as well.
Right.
And I know you have more, Hannah. We kind of got derailed a little bit
Yeah,
there, but it is nice to go in a room and sound like we know a little bit without having to tell them everything. So that those little gems are perfect.
Well, I can keep going. I could go over the insurance section and then stop there, or if it seems more valuable for you all to discuss other things or ask questions, you just have the presentation as well.
Um, go back to slides and let's kind of see what's there. And several of the folks in the room have not heard any part of it before. They've been to budget hearings, they've had other material, and I'm hoping if they've got questions, we can jump to them too and see. And the invitation, if there are things they want to know more about, how we can partner with that and give some good information down the road. So yeah, here's our thing. And let's see, did you see my note that Spitzer is going to cost him 3 million and Doe is on his way to prison for 5 years?
I would like to hear more about the insurance and miscellaneous
Great.
increases, personally. So I vote for that.
Sure.
Good.
So, like we saw all the way at the beginning of the presentation, especially in the two initial bigger buckets, dedicated revenue and other general funds, there are big increases in percentages and also dollars devoted to this unfortunately large grouping of things that are kind of obfuscating what exactly is going on. But we can get more into details here. So they have this one group of things, they treat it kind of like public protection, community services, general government, then this program is called insurance reserves and miscellaneous. And it includes employee benefits, workers' compensation, property and casualty risk, IT, fleet services, and other things. So, okay, overall, I think this is my first one. Yeah. So overall, this category increased by $900 million. So you can see that down here. From last year to this year, the variance, the amount increase was $900 million, which is, really almost a tenth or I don't know, 1/11th or something that of the budget, considering that the whole budget is 10 point something billion dollars. And it increased 125%. So more than doubled. So what is that what is that going to? Well, we can see that part of it was an increase in, well, I guess this is a large percentage, but not a very large dollar. So let me take that back. We can see that a big part of it was the increase in property and casualty risk insurance. So that increased by $373 million, 50% since last year. So that's accounting for, I don't know, 40% of the increase. But there's also the largest increase is this miscellaneous category. Unfortunately, we really can't find out very much about that. I'll show you a little bit more in the next slides. So there's also a $488 million or 673% increase in miscellaneous spending. And what is that? So I tried to track it down here. These are two different screenshots from the budget. You can see this screenshot, explains what this category can go to. It can go to transferring money from the general fund to other places. It can go to contingency appropriations for unanticipated salary and benefit issues. And it can go to appropriations to fund general fund activities that come up throughout the year. You can see that, that increased really dramatically by almost $500 million here. But this information doesn't have anything about, what are they doing? So then we can go to a later part of the budget and we can see, unfortunately, those accounting categories that aren't really very useful to the average person or really to the Board of Supervisors or to anyone evaluating the budget. But we can see that, the main increase is in this other financing uses category, and that there's also a big increase in appropriation for contingencies category. And so the appropriation for contingencies makes sense to me. Not that I know what they're doing, but there are, as the budget framing suggests, a lot of things that could happen during the year. There's a lot of contingency planning that needs to be done. So to some extent, saving money for contingencies makes sense. But what is that other financing uses? What is that $376 million? So the budget text, yeah, go ahead.
No, this is Alice. I was going to say that one of the things that was mentioned in Sarmiento's budget analysis was that the oh God, what's the name of the fire that happened? It's a weird name for the fire.
It was
It's an area of,
it
what was
was
that?
it,
What
it
was,
was in Tustin. It was a hangar, an old World War
yeah,
II hangar.
Right. And they said this was interesting because I didn't know that the city is responsible for 5 million of those dollars of costs, and the county is responsible for the rest. So I'm not sure if that includes the fires that were literally, we had a lot of fires last year, but I'm not sure the amount of expense for each of those fires. So that could be one of them.
Alice, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think I'd like to correct a little something you said. That the county was obligated for the first 5 million. The county,
Oh, it's just
the
the opposite.
yeah,
Okay.
the rest that they were being sued for was $30 million, and
Yeah.
the insurance is paying that.
Yeah. Okay, you heard better. Thank you.
I mean, that's really helpful. And I think the point here, I wouldn't say is that it's, not a legitimate use of funds. It's that this is, $376 million. And when we looked at the net county cost for housing and community development is $1.6 million. So we need to be able to see a lot more from the budget. I mean, this is not this is not just chump change, right? It's the whole sheriff's, I think it's like almost the whole sheriff's net county cost too, right? So it's a huge amount of money, and we really cannot not someone who has looked at many county budgets can't figure it out. So someone who who's just trying to be an involved resident can't figure it out, and I would be honestly surprised if many of the board of supervisors really know, like, yes, some money does need to go to fire to costs related to the fire. Some money may be related to Mental Health Services Act, less funding being available and wanting to spend more funding, more of the county's funding on that. Um, we can, in terms of like the kernel true situation, right? We can say that we can see how much property and casualty risk increased. We can get a little bit of information about how much Mental Health Services Act funding decreased, but there's really this 376 million. Mhm. And the discretionary funds, unfortunately, they're not grouped in any way in the budget that you can readily identify. Some of the supervisors put information in their section of the budget about how they spent the funds, but you really need to go to this separate section of the Orange County website where they have transparency reports that then show the amount available to each supervisor for discretionary funding and how they propose to use it. And so again, the average person cannot figure out where that is, and B, yeah, it's it's not junk, it's not a small amount once you times it by 5.